Okay, admitting people in now.
Okay, a very good afternoon over here in Malaysia and a very good morning to our speakers for today, all the way in Scotland. We are having the session being recorded now, and we'll probably, at least on my end, I'm hearing a lot of dinging sounds as we admit people in. But a very warm welcome to our COASTAR workshop, and I understand that we have about 200 plus people registering for this workshop, which indicates that it is highly popular. So I'm very excited to present this session on how to write winning proposals. And I think the key point here is winning. So we are very proud to feature our speakers, which I will introduce in a short while. Before we get started, I'm going to do a bit of housekeeping. Okay. Next slide, Sun Long. Okay, well, I think because of the nature of Microsoft Teams, most of you are probably muted by default. You can have the option of cameras turned off, but I ask that we keep it turned off for now until we have our interactive session. During the presentation, do use the chat box. You can see the icon, the round icon on the top called chat. Please use that, to communicate with us, especially if you can't see or hear anything. This event will be recorded and made available to the participants via a shared link, and we will also be having it on our COASTAR website. And at the end of the presentation, we will be having a short poll-based survey for all of the participants so that we can get your feedback on how we did for today. Next slide, Sunlo. Okay, before we get started, I'd like to introduce our program called COASTARS, which stands for Empowering Malaysia's Future Leaders in Coastal, Ocean, Actionable and Sustainable Teaching and Research. This program is proudly funded by British Council in collaboration with, go ahead, you can move on to the next slide. And we are very proud to have the mentorship of multidisciplinary researchers from Edinburgh Napier University, University Malaya and University Science Malaysia. And our aim here is to develop a fellowship that will foster new network with a focus on early career researchers, academic mentors, as well as relevant stakeholders engaged in coastal issues. So this is going to be a year-long project, and we are very happy to feature some exciting activities, including this particular proposal writing session. Next slide. So we have our COASTAR mentors here. I am the lead for the Malaysian side. I'm Amy Tan, by the way, a senior lecturer from University Malaya. And from the Edinburgh Napier University, we have our Professor Mark Huxham, who is the UK lead for this program. And we also have a diverse group of mentors here that and also our fellows. Next slide. We also have selected a number of outstanding fellows from very diverse disciplines who have an interest in coastal sustainability issues. So we are very happy to work with these fellows for the remaining of this year for our activities. And I think with that, that will be our short introduction in COASTAR, and I would be happy now to pass the time over to, oh wait, and I'm supposed to be introducing our speakers. Okay, so for today, we are very proud to have Mark himself being our speaker on how to win proposals, and he intended to make this a highly interactive activity. So I asked that, all of the excellent participants that we have here, to keep the chat box as busy as possible. We have Gráinne Barkess as well, who is I will let her introduce herself in a short while, but she will also be helping to facilitate the chat box and to keep the interactive session going. So without further ado, let me pass this time over to Mark and Gráinne.
Thank you very much, Amy, and hello to everybody who's present. It's a real pleasure to be joining you this morning, as it is here in Edinburgh in Scotland. What I'm hoping to do today is to just cover some of the basics of how you might want to write proposals. I'm going to be dealing with proposals in science, and in particular in applied science, but what I say I hope will be of use to people from very different disciplines. So I'm a professor of coastal ecology, of environmental biology here at Edinburgh Napier University, which means that most of my work is around coastal ecosystems like mangroves and seagrass. A lot of that work is very applied, so working with communities and trying to make real changes on the ground. But I also work in pedagogy, looking at how people learn, and I've had the pleasure of working with colleagues from many, many different disciplines: engineering, anthropology, sociology, economics, and of course biology and forestry, which means that I've had some experience of working with people applying for funding from very different bodies. So I want to share some of that today. I'm just going to let my colleague Gráinne introduce herself briefly, and then we'll make a start.
Thank you, Mark. It's lovely to be here today. I'm looking forward to the session with everybody. So my name is Gráinne Barkess, and I head up research and development here in Edinburgh Napier University. And so my role involves supporting our researchers in their projects and learning about research skills. So today we're focusing on how to write winning research proposals, but I also provide support to our PhD students around sort of wide research skills, also with working with supervisors and principal investigators on how they run their grants and build and develop research teams across the different disciplines that we have at the university. So I'm really excited to be working with you all in this workshop and look forward to hearing some of the ideas that come out of the time together. So back over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Gráinne. So I'm going to share my slides, and I'm relying on my colleagues Amy and Gráinne. Just let me know if you can't see those slides or if you can't hear me. Does that look okay?
Looks good, Mark.
That's great. So everybody, what I'm going to do is spend around 10 to 15 minutes just talking first of all about some key terms that we need to understand when we're writing proposals, and then I'm going to invite you to share some of your ideas and thoughts around proposals that might be relevant for you. So I'm going to start off with some simple terms that, although they're simple, people often confuse them in proposals. So as well as writing many proposals, I also have the experience of sitting on assessment panels for various UK grant giving bodies, and so I also read many proposals too. And although the terms that I'm going to discuss are simple, it's common for people to confuse them and to get them wrong. So I want to start with the ideas of aims, objectives, outcomes and outputs, and then later on we'll talk a little bit about a theory for change, which is something that many proposal developers and many funders now require in their proposals. So this is a picture of Edinburgh, and I think there are two people there making a proposal. One's making a proposal to the other. That's not the kind of proposal that we're going to talk about today. Nobody will end up getting married at the end of this workshop. So first of all, we need to think about who might fund proposals. So when we're writing proposals, we're essentially writing to a group of people, or perhaps even an individual person, asking to fund our work. And there are lots of different sources of funding. And certainly at the start of my career as a scientist, I thought really only of those very formal government-led sources of funding. And they're perhaps the obvious ones. So in the UK, there are national research councils, like the National Environment Research Council, that funds research. And there are other government departments, like the Department for International Development, which also funds research. Amy, I know that's true as well in Malaysia. Are you able to say anything briefly about those possible sources of funding in Malaysia?
I sure can. Thanks, Mark. So I'm focusing this obviously because I'm also from the science background, so I'm aware more of the opportunities that are available for more on the science end, although we really should be talking more about cross-discipline kind of funding. But some of the ones that might be relevant for early career researchers would be the Malaysian Torre Science Foundation funding, and I think the call is perhaps still ongoing at the moment or closing. We have a fundamental research grant scheme that is by the Ministry of Higher Education. And another example that I can think of is actually for those that focus on conservation as well as working across different disciplines, the National Conservation Trust Fund, and the announcement just came out. That one is by KETSA, the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resource has also just come up. So if any of you are interested in these opportunities, do feel free to reach out, and we're happy to give the links to this. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Amy. So there are a range of government funders, both in the UK and in Malaysia. There are also, of course, institutions. If you're fortunate enough to be working at a wealthy institution, they may provide grants. That's going to be much easier for you to achieve that funding if you're within that institution. Businesses are depending on your discipline, businesses can be a very important source of funding. They may be the main source of funding if you're in a very applied area like engineering, but those of us working in other areas often can apply for funding from business. And what I would say is that that kind of proposal, you may need to cultivate some contacts within the business. So often businesses will fund specific pieces of work that are of relevance and importance to their activities, rather than put out a call for proposals. And what that means is that if you can spend time cultivating connections with business and looking for their needs and seeing if there are interactions with your expertise and needs, then that can be a good way of developing a long-term relationship and achieving funding from business. Charities have been very important for me. There are many national and international charities that are invested in conservation work and coastal conservation work. So the charity there, Earthwatch Institute, they funded they provided 8 years of funding for me on the back of really quite a small and modest proposal. And often charities, although they may not bring very much money, they can bring other kinds of resources to your work. So for example, Earthwatch works by recruiting volunteers to come and work with scientists, and that's worth many hundreds of thousands of pounds, it may be, because there's a group of people who are doing work for you essentially for free, but also bringing all of their own skills and enthusiasm and connections, so they can be a really helpful source of funding. And then finally, individuals. I've been fortunate to have a number of postgraduate students funded by wealthy, well, one particular wealthy individual who very explicitly wants to, he's quite elderly, and he wants to contribute to work on climate change because he's worried about the state of the world. And so that kind of funding comes on the back again of knowing a particular individual, cultivating that relationship. But even in that case, I still had to write a proposal to this individual, and he was very keen to look at that proposal and to understand it. So all of these kinds of funding are going to require some sort of proposal. The type of proposal, of course, will vary depending on who you're writing it for. And sometimes there are what's called targeted calls. So a targeted call is when a funder says, we need the work done on this particular topic, and we're inviting bids on that topic. Sometimes there's an open call, so the government will just say at this particular date, for example, you can apply for anything in coastal conservation or anything in biology, in environmental biology. So a targeted call, clearly you won't be successful unless you address the objectives of the targeted call. With an open call, your individual chances of success are much smaller because so many people will apply for it, but it allows you to explore your own interests and passions. And finally, proposals may be for pure research. You might want to test a science hypothesis which has no impact necessarily in the real world. If you're a theoretical physicist, that will probably be your main interest. On the other hand, most proposals, particularly in my area, also look for impact. That term impact means, can you change activities, practices, policies on the ground in the real world, not just in publication. And sometimes proposals aren't about impact or research. They're for things like networking. They're for creating new networks and groups of people who will go on to do the science and to have the impact. So all of these terms are really important. Clearly, you can't apply for a networking grant if it's all about doing your own piece of work. So I want to talk briefly now about aims and objectives. The most important, the first and perhaps most important part of your proposal development is to think, well, what's the aim? What do I want to achieve with this proposal? And I've got some possible aims and some possible objectives on this slide. These things ringed in blue are aims. So an aim to understand how poverty affects educational aspirations. The reason why that's an aim and not an objective is because it's extremely broad. That's a very, very big question. In fact, that's a question that has taken up, thousands and thousands of people's working lives over hundreds of years, certainly. To investigate the potential for herbal remedies for stomach complaints in rural areas, that's a much narrower aim, but it's still an aim. The other examples here are objectives, and really the main difference between an aim and an objective is that an aim is broad and an objective is narrow, and it tells you how it's going to go about achieving what you want to do. So your aim may be to understand how poverty affects the educational aspirations of children. The objective related to that may be to correlate stated educational ambitions for children with the socioeconomic status of their parents. So that's how you're going to go about, that's the mechanism that you're going to go about achieving your aim. So people quite commonly confuse and mix up these two different things. And I think almost every proposal is going to have a broad aim. I want to investigate the impacts of fishery on mangrove ecosystems, but it's going to also have objectives, and usually more than one objective. So you're going to need to write an aim, and you're also going to need to write objectives. And most people who assess objectives will be using this acronym when they do it. So this is a very commonly taught acronym for people who are sitting on assessment panels. And the acronym is that objectives should be SMART, and that means they should be specific, they should be measurable, they should be achievable, they should be relevant, and they should be time bound. So for example, I might have an aim to do some research that examines the relationship between the amount of seagrass, the seagrass coverage, and the fisheries production in the west coast of Malaysia. So that's quite that's a broad aim. My objective, I could have a number of objectives under that aim, but I might write an objective like this that says, okay, my objective is to compare the amount of seagrass along the coast with the fish caught by inshore fisheries. If I wrote that objective, I'm quite likely to have my proposal rejected. And that's the reasons for that is that, first of all, it's not very specific. When I say compare, what do I mean by compare, by that word? I can be much more specific, much clearer what I mean by that word. The amount, what does that mean? What's the units of the amount? Is this objective even achievable? If I'm saying along the whole coast, how could I do that? That would involve probably millions and millions of dollars to do that piece of research. So it doesn't seem very achievable, this objective. Well, is it relevant? I'm interested in seagrass. I'm talking about all of inshore fisheries in this objective. Not all fish in the inshore depend on seagrass. We already know that from the literature. So this is a poor objective. A much better objective using SMART criteria would be to use regression models. I'm being specific. I'm saying what I'm going to do to determine the relationship between the aerial extent of seagrass. Now I'm talking about what I mean by the amount of seagrass. It's not the weight, it's some measure of aerial extent. And the prawn catch. We know that prawn or shrimp often depend heavily on seagrass. And then I'm talking here about a specific district over a particular period of years, past 10 years. That's a much better objective. So your aims can be broad, but your objectives need to be narrow and they need to be SMART. Another piece of terminology that you'll often come across in proposals and you'll be asked to deal with in proposals is the difference between outputs and outcomes. So an output is usually a physical thing, something that you can see or measure or produce or share. So a report, a published report based on this piece of research might be an output. An outcome is some sort of change, perhaps in understanding or perhaps in policy. So an outcome and an output are different, and often you're asked to do both. So here, for example, my outcome might be developing evidence and sharing that evidence for the importance of seagrass for inshore shrimp fisheries. The output might be the published paper or report that contains that evidence. So I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of work now. I'd like you to, first of all, individually just pause and let's spend 2 or 3 minutes. What I want you to do is to think about a proposal for work that perhaps you're already working on that. Perhaps it's speculative, perhaps you're thinking about it for the future. It needs to be relevant to you and to your own aspirations in your careers and your disciplines. Just write down very quickly, first of all, what is the aim of that proposal, very broad proposal, and give one objective. And if it's relevant, write down a hypothesis that you want to test. And we'll come back and talk about when you should be using hypotheses in your proposals shortly. So let's just I'm going to give you 2 or 3 minutes to do that on your own, and then I'm hoping that you're willing to share that in the chat with us. And don't worry if you're not currently writing proposals, or even if your ideas are not very well formed at the moment. Think about some work that you'd most like to do, and think about what kinds of proposals you might write for that work. Thanks very much, everybody. It's great to see those examples coming into the chat. I'm going to give you another minute or so. And in particular, if anybody has a hypothesis that they think they need to test, please do share that with us. Thank you very much, everybody. So there's such an interesting list of disciplines and ideas coming in. It's really great to see that. I want to pick up first of all on that key difference between aims and objectives, and I'm seeing lots of really nice examples of that. I'm wondering if Lei Cheng, are you able to, you've put in an aim which is about looking at skin fibroblast, and you've got very different objective there, or very specific objective. Are you able just to tell us what the key differences are there between your aim and objectives? And it may be that you you don't have a microphone. If you're able to unmute and speak to us, that would be great.
Hi.
Hi, thank you very much. Well done. People are always scared to do that, so you're being very brave.
Thank you. Yeah, asking what is the difference of my aim and objective. So the CD39 is a surface marker, is a protein expressed on the fibroblast. So my aim is actually to see whether this marker is still there after a long culture or is gone. Right, I guess.
I picked on you, Lei Cheng, because I thought that was so well written. Your aim and objective there was really nice.
Oh, really?
It looks to me like you've been that's a very smart objective. You're talking about, well, you could talk a little bit more about how you quantify CD39, for example, but it's a nice example of how you've got really quite a broad aim and you're narrowing down. While I've got you, I want to ask about your hypothesis as well, if that's okay.
Sure.
So your hypothesis is that long-term culture will reduce CD39 expression on primary skin fibroblast, and that sounds like a sensible hypothesis to me. Why do you know? How do you know that it's good to phrase that as a hypothesis? Why does that make it? Why is that a hypothesis and not an objective?
Why it is not an objective is a hypothesis. It's difficult to. Actually, I don't know how to explain, but I know that what I understand, hypothesis is something what we predict that can happen.
That's great. No, that's absolutely true. Of course, an objective may happen too, or you hope the objective will happen, but yeah. I think the key difference is that a hypothesis is something that you quantitatively test. And it implies to me that you're going to use some kind of statistical test or quantitative method to test whether that really happens or not. And I think that's the key difference. And the hypothesis you've got there, absolutely, you could test that, couldn't you?
Yes, I can.
And I can see some people in the box also. Thank you very much. You've been very brave.
Thank you.
Many of my students hide when I do that, so I was pleased that you appeared. But thank you. You can turn off your camera again now.
Thank you.
Mark,
So-
we've had a question come in from Hamid in the chat about whether a hypothesis is a presumption. You maybe want to just connect into that?
Yes, thank you, Mohammed. And so I will, and I want to talk briefly about hypotheses now. So thanks everybody for sharing. I'm hoping that if you look at those range, and we're here in the room with people from very, very different disciplines, which is very exciting. We've got people from social science disciplines, from medical disciplines, from environmental disciplines. But I think the key point remains that we have these broad aims, we have narrow objectives. We hope those objectives are smart, they're somehow measurable. And for some people, we're having hypotheses as well. And the thing about hypotheses is that it's not just that they're measurable, but they're going to be something that you actually test, almost certainly using a quantitative approach, using a statistical approach. And that means, for example, my colleagues in anthropology or perhaps in qualitative social sciences, they often do not have hypotheses because they're not using statistical approaches to test things. So not all proposals will have hypotheses, but I think probably most of the people here will want to use hypotheses. And I want to just share briefly a few comments on hypotheses. Here's one of my intellectual heroes, Karl Popper, and Popper really is the philosopher who underpins the idea of writing a null hypothesis. And I can see some people in the chat have used this phrase null hypothesis, which is great. It's now feels a little bit old-fashioned to write null hypotheses, but personally I still do it. And that's because a hypothesis is something that you're trying to disprove effectively, a null hypothesis. So you set up a hypothesis that says, for example, there is no correlation between the area of mangrove forest and the abundance of crabs that live in that area. And the reason you say there's no correlation is that the statistical test that you're going to use to test that, some kind of correlation test, actually tests for no relationship. Technically, it tests for no relationship, and the philosophical reasons for that were worked out by Karl Popper almost a century ago. So really, I'd really recommend actually reading Karl Popper's work. Lots of scientists don't read philosophers, but he really influenced a lot of what we do. And he made the point that it's almost impossible to prove something. It's very difficult to prove things. He had a famous phrase about black swans. How do you prove that all swans are white? Well, how many swans do you have to see? Do you see 100 swans? Do you see 1,000, 1,000,000? If they're all white, have you proved that they're all white? Clearly not. So in effect, you have to look at every possible swan in the world. You only have to see one black swan and you've disproven that hypothesis. And that's why he thinks that falsification or null hypotheses are very important. So the key take home here is if you're going to do statistical tests, if you want to test something quantitatively using numbers and you're going to do a statistical test, you're going to need some hypotheses. And you want to be very, very clear about what those hypotheses are. So just a quick summary of where we've got to. Nearly all good proposals, certainly in science subjects, are going to include an aim. So the aim can be broad, but it needs to be well written. They're going to include objectives, and it's best to make those objectives smart, so specific and measurable, time limited, relevant. They're going to require a context of justification. And I'm just checking. I don't think I shared my screen. Are you seeing my screen, Amy?
No, I think you've unshared, Mark.
I unshared. Let me just, sorry, everybody. I'm going back to sharing. I'm hoping you can see that screen now.
Yep, it's good.
So I'm just summarising where we've got to. Sorry, everybody. We need an aim, we need objectives, we need a context of justification, which is really saying, why is this important? Why should anybody care about my proposal, my work? Often that context is very straightforward. If, for example, you're in a medical field, well, I want to cure people. People are suffering, they have this disease. In working in history, it might be much harder. Why should people care that I study the history of the Ubuntu people in East Africa? Well, but it might also be important. So you might have to spend a bit more time on that context, depending on your discipline. You need the right team. So everybody who reads your proposal will be asking the question, can this person or these people actually do the work that they're proposing? And of course, that means you need people with the right experience. That makes it difficult for you at the start of your career because you may not have that experience. So you're going to have to work harder about that, and you may well have to involve more experienced people in your proposal, or make sure that you're on the proposal of other people to gain that experience. Of course, you need appropriate methods, and you're going to be asked to justify your resources as well. Give me £1 million to go and look at carbon in a mangrove. Well, probably not. Okay, it doesn't cost that much. So you're going to have a costed budget. Okay, I want to talk.
Mark, just before we move on, there's a question that's come in that I think is really interesting around the main challenge in writing a proposal, around any tips or strategies to better highlight the X factor of the proposal, what makes it stand out, I think.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, and there will be time for questions as well. But just on that point, it's a good point, but in my experience, most of the proposals I reject are not necessarily because they don't look important. They don't have that X factor, if you like. Usually they're rejected because they failed to meet the criteria, or they failed to be clear in one of those things that I've just said. So you might have a proposal that looks really great. You think, wow, that's really exciting science, but the grant giving body, which will be looking at possibly dozens or even hundreds of proposals in some cases, if they say, well, actually, I can't say that the objectives are clear, or this doesn't actually meet the requirements of the call, or I look at the team and I think there's no way these people have the experience to deliver what they want to deliver. So I'm not saying the X factor isn't important, and my main tip actually about X factor is structure of how you write. So if you've got an X factor, it needs to be quite clearly stated early on in the introduction, in the context of your proposal. So you want it up there in the first two, perhaps the first 1 or 2 paragraphs. You want to start building towards that X factor. So it's really about how you explain it in the proposal. So I'm not saying that's not important, but what I am saying is most proposals are rejected, not because they're not worthwhile on paper, but because one of these other factors, one of these other boxes is not ticked by the assessors. We can come back to that in the question session shortly, if that would help. It's now very common for proposals to include something called a theory of change, and this happens in applied areas of science, but it's becoming more and more common, and it's common in business. It's common in lots of proposals now. So funders say, what is your theory of change? And what they mean by that is, if we give you this money, how do we know that the money will lead to the outputs and outcomes that you claim? So you're claiming your outcome will be a better understanding of coastal conservation, for example, or better healthcare for people in this particular area. How do we know that's going to happen? Can you convince us? That's what the theory of change is about, and it's something that most scientists and most academics are not very good at. And that's because we're not trained to do that, and our training has mostly been around, understanding and expertise, relevant expertise. But theory of change is, unless you work in that discipline, theory of change is rather different. So here's an example from my own history. I've been researching mangrove ecosystems for more than 20 years, and I was interested in them ecologically. They're fascinating ecosystems. They do all sorts of really interesting ecological and biological things. But my main motivation was because people depend on them, and I thought they were very important and threatened. So I wanted to be able to contribute to their conservation and to the livelihoods of people who live in and around mangroves. And this was my theory of change. I didn't write it out like this, but this was what was going on in my head. I thought, OK, I'll get some funding. I'll go to a mangrove forest. I'll study fish in that mangrove forest as a fisheries biologist. Then I can show that those fish move from the mangrove to the coral reef. OK, and that therefore people catch those fish and they rely on them for their food and their income. I'll publish this in a scientific paper, and then I'll sit back. OK, and somebody else, some other manager or politician or important business person will read my scientific paper and will think, oh, this is very important. What we'd better do is save these mangroves, stop the mangrove forest being cut down. That was my theory of change. Now, I'm not saying that any of you are as naive and as foolish as I was, but you can probably see why that doesn't work very well. And if you write a theory of change like that now, if you put that down in your proposals, you will not be funded. So we need to do a bit better than that. If you're asked for a theory of change, you want to try and connect the long term with the short term goals of your project. So your project might have this objective, but how's that going to lead long term? How's that going to move policy or development or practice long term? It can be used to evaluate your project. So at the end of your project, you might look back on your theory of change and say, well, have we actually done what we hoped to do? And it makes you think about the stakeholders, the different people who are going to be involved. If your piece of research is very narrow, it's just you and your lab, maybe the stakeholders are just you and your funder and the people that you work with. But usually in bigger proposals now, there are many other stakeholders involved. For example, business, for example, charity, for example, local communities that you're working with. So thinking about theory of change can really help you think more broadly about your research. And you need to go through a process a bit like this. So you need to think, well, what inputs do I need to define this problem? What will I actually do during the project? Of course, that's already linked to all of the methods that you've been thinking about. Clearly, very importantly, you need to think about your assumptions. So what have I assumed must be true in order for these plans to work? And how likely are these assumptions? How risky are they? The outputs and the outcomes we've talked about already. And then, what's the likely impact? What will actually change as a result of your work? So that was my original theory of change. I just go and do some research, I publish it, other people read it, and then good things happen. That was my theory. That was a very naive theory of change. It doesn't work. And where my own work has gone over the last 2 decades actually has been focusing more and more down on the people, the key people who are able to make the change, who are facilitating and benefiting the change. So in my own case, I work with communities, particularly in East Africa, in Kenya, and we raise money from selling credits, carbon credits, and we use that money in order to fund conservation and people's livelihoods. So the difference here is, yes, there's still science. I still need to do the science. I need to understand the carbon, but I've got a mechanism for raising cash, and I've got people that I'm working with, the key stakeholders who manage these forests, who live with them, who are going to actually make the change. So there are resources there for them. So that's a theory of change that well, has worked so far. So just a little bit on validity of assumptions. You can see this is the kind of text that you might have to use if you wanted to propose a project like that. You know, can you raise enough funds? Is that plausible? Is it valid? Well, we know what funds you can raise on, that's the voluntary carbon market. We can go and find out. So we can say, yeah, we think we can raise those funds. Can communities actually work together? Do they have the legal background? Is the law there to allow them to do that? In Kenya, that's true. Can we sell carbon credits? You know, how do we get the income? If we got credits, where do we sell it? Well, you might have to do something like find somebody who can sell credits for you to do that. And well, what about the political landscape? So we're scientists, we may not think too much about politics, but actually in a project like this, you're going to have to think about politics, because if the political situation says, no, you can't do this, then clearly your theory of change will fail. You won't make the impact. So just to summarize on theory of change, actually, even if you're not required to write one, most funders will say you must include a theory of change if they want one. Even if you're not required to write one, if you're doing applied research that wants to make a social difference, then I think it's a really good idea to write one out for yourself and include some of that in your proposals, because it shows people that you've thought carefully about this. And when you do that, you should include a list of your assumptions. So you're saying, yes, I know there are risks. There are always risks. We don't know what will happen in the future. We can't change. We don't control change, but we can think about it, and we can assess the risks. So thanks very much, everybody. We're coming up now to the end of our hour, and I want to make sure that we've got space for questions. So to summarize what I've said, I can see from the chat that many of you are experienced researchers and that you're thinking hard about the work that you're already doing, and that's great. I would emphasize just going back to these basics though, because I do read many proposals from quite experienced researchers that still make these mistakes. Try to distinguish between your aims, your objectives, include hypotheses if you're going to do statistical tests, and you can write those as null hypotheses. Be aware of the difference between outputs and outcomes, and think about a theory of change, even if you're not required to produce one. So thanks very much, and we have some time for questions.
Thanks very much, Mark. I just wanted to check in with you. Are you able to see the chat, Mark, or would you like me to read some of the questions that have popped up?
So I've just opened the chat, and so I can read it, but it looks like we're not going to be able to cover all of those points. So what we should try and do is pick out a few that might capture some of the questions. People are welcome, as far as I'm concerned, they're welcome to speak as well. It's always nice to hear people's voices.
Okay, so maybe Sun Long can unmute our participants, but we do definitely have 2 questions so far on theory of change. So Sam is asking, from what I gathered, the theory of change must have practicality. And Nor Adwa is also asking to explain a little bit more about the theory of change. And this is probably quite familiar to a lot of our listeners. So maybe, Mark, this is a good question to be addressing.
Thanks. Yeah, so let's talk a bit more about that. It is quite new language, but as I say, it's quite common now, at least in international funding bodies, for them to ask for a theory of change for United Nations, for example. And it applies particularly if you're doing any kind of applied research. So your research is, I'm going to look at the requirements of people in a refugee camp for nutrition, and what I want to do as a result of that research is to improve the nutritional status of the refugees living in that camp. So to do that piece of research, you need good sociological skills, but you'd also need medical skills and nutritional skills. There's lots of different skills involved in that, but clearly you want to have it's not that you just want to understand, you want to actually make things better for the people in that refugee camp. So you're wanting to change things on the ground. And if you just say, right, I'm going to go and do some research, I'm going to find out what nutrients people are missing in this camp, and then I'm going to let you know. I'm going to let them know, oh, you're short on vitamin A, and then walk away. You won't get funding, almost certainly. So you're going to have to think about how the change happens as a result of your work. Now, it may not be you who can do the change. You may not have the power to make the change, but you want to be able to think about how the change will happen, even if you're not doing it. So, for example, your theory of change may be, I do this research, I find out the vitamins that people are missing, and then I make sure that I go and visit the United Nations Commissioner on Refugees. I talk to the relevant ministry in the government, and I talk to elders, people in the community who are able to influence people. So it might be a dissemination plan. That might be your theory of change. So it's about thinking, okay, what's the ultimate goal of this research, and what's the pathway to achieve that ultimate goal, and being as explicit as you can. And of course, if you have large ambitions, so my ambition was to save all the mangroves in the world, to stop mangrove destruction. That's a big ambition. You know, it's fine to have big ambitions, but you need to be clear about the risks, you know, and your ability to influence those. So you might say, well, I want to influence the whole world, but my experience and expertise is just in this little site right here. And if I work with this particular person who's, you know, cutting down these trees, I might be able to stop them. And that's my contribution.
Oops, I did a classic mistake. I muted myself. I hope that explanation by Mark did help to explain about theory of change. So I think maybe, as you said, right, we want to think about, you know, what is it that we wanted to achieve? What is that vehicle of change? And then, you know, it is probably related to practicality, right? Probably from the funders' point of view, you know, they wanted to make sure that you've thought through, you know, carefully about, you know, how you're actually going to achieve it, and underlying the impact that you wanted to achieve. You know, there are probably some assumptions you make. So I guess it's an exercise to help you to think through, you know, whether what you said you would do is a cohesive. Would that be right, Mark? Something like that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And I'm seeing all these other questions coming in too. Very interesting questions. I'm aware that we're going to run out of time, and I'm wondering if we may be able to circulate a few thoughts on some of these questions afterwards. Soon Lung might have an idea of whether we can do that, and we have contacts for people.
For sure. Yes, we are coming to the end of the session, and I think Sun Lung is going to administer a poll after this. But, you know, if you do have comments and thoughts, you know, particularly on things that you wanted to see as a sequel to our webinar, particularly, you know, if you had some topics that you are interested for us to tackle, we would be happy to consider a follow-up to this webinar session. So I want to thank all of our participants for, you know, for your active inputs, right, and especially to Lei Cheng for showing up your face, you know, and for a fun interactive session. So I think I'll pass the session over to well, actually Sun Lung has now. Sorry
to interrupt you. I just wanted to finish on, there was a very interesting question about failure there. Yeah. And I wanted to, that's an experience. If you work in science, you're going to be rejected and you're going to be failed. And actually, if that never happens to you, it probably means that you're not being ambitious enough in your proposals, or you're a genius, you know, or very lucky. You're the daughter of the minister or something. So you need to, it's tough. So you need to expect rejection. For Natural Environment Research Council here in the UK, they accept only 18% of their proposals. So you've got an 82% chance of rejection for that funder, and for most funders it will be that you'll have a higher chance of rejection than success. Of course, that might be different for, you know, if you're working with a particular business or an individual. So it's tough, and I guess all I can say about rejection is try to, as far as possible, to learn from it. Gráinne has said, try to get feedback. It's really tough. You don't want to hear it, do you, if you've been rejected? You've got to try and overcome that, hear the feedback, and keep the proposal, because you might have a chance next year. You might be able to submit it again, improve it. There might be a difference. I've had proposals that have been rejected, and then the funder came back to me the next year and said, actually, you know, you did pretty well in that, and now there's a bit of money and you can put that in. So that does happen. So it's tough being rejected, but it's part of work as a scientist, and you know, you have to do your best to learn from that.
That's a wonderful way to wrap up a difficult session, I think. Thanks very much, Mark, for that input, and thank you everybody again. We have Sun Long, who has posted the poll, posted the link to the poll. Is using menti.com. Please do give your thoughts and opinions about our session, and we will take a break now, I guess, because the next session that we will be having is actually with our COASTAR fellows. So thank you very much, everybody, and you can see right now the results coming in live from Menti. So thanks for letting us know that you have found this session to be very helpful. And again, if you do have thoughts about, you know, what you would like to hear, either from Mark himself, you know, maybe you wanted to hear more about Mark's previous failures, which I would love to hear more about, because, you know, it's good to learn how to write winning proposals, and I think sometimes a good way to learn it is by, you know, looking at not so great proposals and how to move on from there. So, so Mark, you know, if there's requests for this, you know, maybe we can consider having this session the next round. Thank you again, everybody. I really appreciate your feedback. 69%, Mark, highly satisfied. Kudos to you. Thanks so much as well, Gráinne, for facilitating a wonderful session. So with this, we're going to close this open session, and take care, everybody. And I wish especially all the early career researchers and students all the best in developing winning proposals moving forward.